At 7 a.m. on February 23, 1945, the volcanic air around the southern slopes of Suribachi vibrated with the steady hammer of Japanese machine gun fire. Marines were pinned flat against the black sand, their uniforms already coated with ash, as if the island itself were trying to swallow them. 2 hours earlier, nearly 70 men had fallen trying to cross a stretch of ground shorter than a football field. 4 Sherman tanks had been stopped cold, their armor scarred and burning their crews either dead or trapped inside. The Americans knew exactly where the killing came from. 6 concrete pillboxes arranged like the teeth of a saw poured out intersecting bands of fire so precise they felt engineered to erase anything that moved. No rifle squad could get close. No demolition team survived long enough to place charges. Every attempt ended the same way. Another body dragged back through the sand, while the pillboxes kept firing relentless, patient, almost mechanical. The order passed down the line was simple and desperate. Break those positions before noon, or the entire advance would stall. Men looked at one another silently, asking the same question: how do you reach a bunker that kills you 30 yards away? Then a figure stepped forward, adjusting the straps of a 70-pound fuel tank on his back. He said nothing. He simply moved. Some Marines stared, stunned that anyone would volunteer to walk into a furnace. Others stood frozen, watching the improbable shape of a man carrying a weapon most knew had a survival rate lower than any job on the island. A flamethrower operator was not just exposed, he was the priority target. If a bullet pierced the tank, he would vanish in a flash of burning fuel. Still, he kept walking. The ground trembled with each Japanese burst as he crawled inch by inch across sand so hot it bled through his gloves. Tracers stitched the air above him. Mortar fragments snapped past his ears. He paused only when a Sherman groaned to life beside him, its turret rotating to provide what little cover it could. For a moment, he was hidden in the tank's shadow. Then he sprinted again, closing the final yards toward the first pillbox while men behind him held their breath. They knew that if he fell, the assault died with him. Yet something in the way he moved suggested a man who had already accepted the cost, already crossed an invisible threshold where fear no longer slowed the legs. He reached the wall, pressed himself against the concrete, raised the nozzle. One breath, one heartbeat, and then the fire erupted. He had not been shaped for war in any traditional sense. Long before the Marines put a uniform on his back, he was waking before dawn on a farm in West Virginia, working the kind of labor that builds endurance in places a man does not realize until much later. Chopping wood, hauling feed, fixing fences that broke after every storm. It was the quiet kind of training that teaches a body to push through when it is tired and to keep pushing when tired becomes exhaustion. By the time he tried to enlist in 1942, the recruiter told him he was too short. Come back when the requirements change, and he did, returning again and again, until they finally opened the door. He stepped in without a second thought. The country needed bodies. He offered his. When he reached training, he learned something else. Strength was not the rare commodity in the Corps. Plenty of men were strong. Plenty could run shoot, curse, and endure. But very few could carry 70 pounds on their back, breathe in vaporized fuel, and still move toward an enemy position. The flamethrower teams needed people who did not panic when heat touched their skin, who did not flinch when the world flashed bright. He discovered almost by accident that he could. Instructors noticed. They watched how he handled the heavy tanks, how he steadied the nozzle, how he managed the cumbersome ignition unit with a kind of instinct that others lacked. Before long, the decision was made for him. You will carry fire. The words were not a suggestion. He learned the machine quickly. The M2 flamethrower was simple in construction and unforgiving in use. Twin fuel cylinders pressurized by nitrogen. A wand-like projector fitted with an ignition system. A burst of flame that lasted barely longer than a breath. 1.5 seconds, maybe 2 if you squeezed the trigger, with perfect timing. That was all a man had to clear a bunker mouth. And yet, in those 2 seconds, temperatures inside a pillbox could jump to nearly 1,000 degrees, melting air, swallowing oxygen-ending resistance in a single, violent blink. But to reach that lethal moment, you had to get close enough that the enemy could touch you with a grenade or a bullet, or the fixed bayonet they were known to charge with. During field exercises, he moved with a peculiar calm. Other flamethrower operators braced themselves before firing. He simply exhaled almost casually, then opened the flame. Instructors murmured about him in low tones. Some men are overwhelmed by the responsibility of carrying something that can kill them as easily as the enemy. Others treat the weapon like a tool and nothing more. He fell into the second group. It was not confidence, it was acceptance. A quiet realization that fear wasted time. Off duty, he spoke little. He wrote letters home in a cramped hand lines that described nothing about the danger ahead. He spent hours cleaning the valve assemblies of the nozzle, studying the way fuel atomized under pressure, understanding how to compensate for wind or how terrain might funnel flame into unexpected directions. In hindsight, it feels almost eerie how methodical he was, as if he had been preparing for Iwo Jima long before anyone knew the island's name. According to the after-action accounts, other operators often failed to complete even one approach against a Japanese bunker. He completed several in training without a single misfire. Still, no exercise could replicate the suffocating heat of volcanic ash, the smell of cordite, the weight of knowing that every man in your company depended on you. And there was something else. A thought he rarely voiced, almost a whisper beneath the clang of military routine. If he did not carry the flame, someone else would. Someone less prepared, someone less likely to survive. That knowledge settled on him with a pressure heavier than the steel tank. On the eve of the assault at 4:30 a.m., when the camp was still dark and the horizon flickered with distant naval gunfire, he checked the igniter assembly one last time. He wiped ash from the fuel cap. He adjusted the straps to stop them from cutting into his shoulders. Men around him muttered prayers or cursed quietly or stared into the dark. He simply stood waiting. If I place myself in that moment, I believe he already understood something the rest were still grappling with. The island was a labyrinth designed to kill them. Pillboxes, trenches, tunnels, hidden apertures that spat lead with mathematical precision. The only way through was to burn the maze open one chamber at a time, and he knew they would ask him to do it. 14 hours later, when the order finally came and he stepped into that terrible open ground, it was not bravery that pushed him forward. It was inevitability. A sense that every mile of highway he had driven, every chore he had done as a boy, every rejection at the recruiting office, every late-night cleaning of the flamethrower, had converged on this single hour. The hour when a quiet man, carrying a tank of fuel on his back, would be asked to break the unbreakable. At 9:10 a.m., the sand shook again. Another mortar round slamming into the ridge above the stalled Marines, and he started moving before the dust settled, crawling low, dragging the heavy tanks on his back, as if nothing in the world weighed more. The first pillbox was less than 40 yards away, but in that 40 yards lay a killing field, carved by intersecting arcs of Japanese fire. Every Marine who tried earlier had been cut down. He had watched them fall. He knew the pattern, the rhythm, the split-second pauses when the gunners inside shifted angle or swapped ammunition drums. He slid forward in those tiny openings, barely wider than a breath. The sand was volcanic and hot enough to burn through cloth. It clung to his skin mixed with sweat, turning his arms into black paste. Tracers snapped overhead. A round smashed into a rock inches from his face, showering him with shards. He kept moving. A Sherman tank to his left lurched forward, steel grinding over the sand, trying to give him a shadow to hide under. The tank commander cracked the hatch and yelled something drowned by machine gun fire, then pointed toward the slit of the pillbox. He nodded once. The tank's gun bellowed the blast, rolling across the ground, but the shell only chipped the pillbox. The Japanese had built these fortifications to withstand naval bombardment. A tank cannon meant nothing. To silence that bunker, someone had to get close enough to reach the breathing slot. He pressed himself against the tank's hull, letting it take the brunt of the fire, then broke away the instant the turret swung. The last few yards he covered in a half-sprint, half-crawl body, twisting unnaturally low, the fuel tanks rattling on his spine. The smell of cordite thickened as he neared the concrete. He reached the blind side of the pillbox just as a burst of fire ripped through the space he had occupied seconds earlier. He flattened himself against the wall. Inside, he could hear voices quick-clipped, well-rehearsed. They were adjusting fields of review fire. They were preparing for another attempt by the Americans. They did not know he was already touching their bunker. He lifted the flamethrower's wand, its weight familiar, almost comforting in its simplicity. One breath. He edged forward until he could see the slit, a thin rectangle of darkness. He squeezed the trigger. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a roaring gust of flame erupted, a violent stream of burning fuel that vanished into the slot, with a hiss that sounded almost like relief. In an instant, The heat soared. Air inside the bunker ignited, a muffled scream, then silence. He stumbled back, heart pounding, more from heat than fear, the nozzle glowing faintly from reflected fire. The tank crew cheered, though he barely heard it. His fuel was nearly gone, maybe a second of fire left, so he turned and ran back across the deadly ground, hunched, gasping, the tanks now heavier for being empty. Marines covered him as best they could, firing relentlessly at the apertures, trying to give him a line of retreat. When he reached the relative safety of a shallow depression, he ripped off the empty fuel unit. Another team rushed forward with a fresh set, 2 men dragging the heavy assembly under fire. One stumbled. A bullet hit the tank beside him, metal sparking. They kept coming. They locked the new unit onto his harness with trembling hands. He said nothing, only adjusted the straps, checked the igniter, then moved again. By 10 a.m., the Japanese inside the surrounding pillboxes realized the pattern. Someone was approaching them directly. Someone unafraid of their crossfire. They intensified their fire. Mortar rounds fell erratically as spotters tried to track him. He dropped flat as a mortar exploded 20 paces away, the concussion lifting him from the sand. He rolled, coughed, resumed crawling. I find myself imagining that moment, the world shaking, the sand raining down, and yet he treated the chaos like background noise. He had a problem to solve, a bunker to break, and no one else could reach it. At the second pillbox, he could not approach from the front. The firing slit was angled to deny direct access. He circled, moving along a jagged outcrop, climbing over broken rock that scraped his legs. A machine gun burst pinned him against a boulder. He waited, listening for the pattern. The gunners inside were rotating between barrels. He pushed off the rock the instant the firing paused. Another sprint, another dive into a pocket of shadow, then a quick lean, just enough to gauge the angle. He raised the wand and unleashed the flame. It caught at once. 2 seconds of fire. Enough. The bunker went quiet. Again he returned for fuel, and again the burden of the tank pressed into his bones. It was only mid-morning, and he had already destroyed more fortifications than most flamethrower operators managed in entire campaigns. But the Japanese had plenty left. Their positions were connected by tunnels. When one bunker fell, survivors often slipped through the earth to reinforce another. He would have to burn them faster than they could relocate. By 10:45 a.m., he had memorized the layout of the connected positions. He saw patterns others missed. A mound of disturbed sand revealing a tunnel mouth. A shallow depression marking a concealed firing pit. A reflection of sunlight flashing briefly off a periscope tube. Each clue guided his next approach. He stopped thinking like an attacker and started thinking like the men who built this maze. If he were them, where would he place the next kill zone? Where would he run if the bunker beside him ignited? At some point, he crossed a threshold from reacting to controlling, shaping the fight with each move, and the Marines behind him felt the shift. One last sprint, one last arc of flame into a narrow vent, and another pillbox fell silent. It was only the beginning. The fight stretched into a brutal rhythm that barely resembled time. By 11 a.m., he was already moving toward another nest of fortifications, the air trembling with the constant percussion of Japanese guns. The sand around him had turned into a shifting sea of impact craters. Smoke rolled low, suffocating, carrying the acrid taste of cordite and burning fuel, making every breath feel stolen rather than earned. He crawled through it like a man tracing the edges of an invisible map, each pillbox a node in a network he was now dismantling piece by piece. Marines watched him weave across the dead ground with a kind of stunned disbelief. The fact that he kept returning, kept refueling, kept forcing himself back up the slope contradicted everything they thought possible under direct fire. Men had died attempting less. He had already succeeded more times than their reports even accounted for. At the next approach, he encountered a new pattern of fire, tighter and more disciplined. These gunners were veterans, likely from units trained to resist close assaults at all costs. They shifted fields of fire, rapidly pinning down anyone who moved more than a few inches at a time. He tested their timing by tossing a small rock across open ground. The gun erupted instantly. They were alert, listening for the smallest cue. This bunker would require a different path. He studied the terrain, spotted a collapsed section of volcanic ridge, forming a jagged spine of protruding rock. He began climbing it slowly, silently, fuel tanks scraping. The ridge carried him above the bunker's main arc of fire, but also exposed him to a secondary aperture designed to catch flanking assaults. A round cracked past his head. He dropped flat, pressed against the sharp stone, until the gunner adjusted angle. Then he slid down the other side, reaching a shallow bend that led directly to the rear of the pillbox. Inside, he heard shouting boots, scraping concrete, men repositioning to face the Marines ahead. They did not expect anyone behind them. He waited, heart hammering, feeling the heat radiating off volcanic rock. Then he leaned into view, fired a burst of flame into the vent that fed the bunker's internal chamber. The interior lit instantly. A hollow thump sounded as stored ammunition ignited. The roof lifted just slightly, dust spilling out from the seams. He pulled back before the blast finished, smoke belching from the bunker like a great exhale. Another position gone. He ran again because stopping meant losing momentum, and momentum was the only shield he possessed. At 11:30 a.m., he moved toward a tight cluster of fighting pits surrounding another pillbox. Each pit housed a rifle crew that stood ready to cut down anyone advancing on the main target. The Marines had been pinned by them all morning. He advanced alone, using debris from earlier explosions as cover. He reached the first fighting hole, thrust the nozzle over the lip, and released a short jet of flame. The rifle pit went silent. He pivoted to the next, repeating the same motion with mechanical precision. 3 pits, 4. By the 5th, the Japanese were firing wildly, desperate to hit a moving shape they could not pin down. One burst tore through the sand near his feet, throwing grit into his eyes. He blinked it away, slid into a shallow gully, and prepared another approach. When the last rifle pit fell, Marines surged forward behind him, finally gaining ground after hours of paralysis. But the bunker ahead remained intact. The firing slit spat a constant stream of bullets, as if powered by the island itself. He approached low, letting the gully guide him until the terrain flattened out. He could feel the heat from his fuel tank mixing with the midday sun sweat, stinging his eyes. He crawled until he was inches from the pillar of concrete, hearing the metallic clink of a machine gun crew loading another belt. He lifted the nozzle. A grenade clattered out of the slit, bouncing unpredictably across the sand. He flinched instinctively, turning his back as the burst rocked the ground. Shrapnel peppered the dirt around him. Somehow he remained intact. He did not hesitate. He lunged forward, jammed the wand toward the slit, and pulled the trigger. Flame roared inside. The slit went dark. He backed off, panting. He had lost track of how many bunkers he had burned by now. The world had shrunk into a series of problem-solving exercises. Identify the angle, determine the blind spot, apply flame. And so, he kept going. At noon, Marines reported movement from a lateral tunnel connected to a secondary pillbox. Survivors were repositioning to reinforce the next strong point. He reached the area before they were fully prepared. As he approached, a Japanese soldier burst from a concealed hatch, bayonet, fixed, charging with a scream. He had no time to raise the nozzle. He stepped sideways, just enough to avoid the blade, swung the wand upward, and fired point blank. The soldier vanished in a shroud of flame that curled upward like a living thing. He kept moving before the smoke settled. A new fuel tank was brought forward by 2 Marines, who sprinted across ground so exposed that even they hesitated to follow after seeing one of their own collapse under machine gun fire earlier. They dropped behind a small embankment, panting. He detached the empty tank with practiced speed, the harness clicking loose. They locked the new tank into place, their hands shaking from adrenaline. He gave them a glance that said, "Everything stay low, get back." They ran, he advanced. The next pillbox had survived multiple direct hits from Sherman tanks. Its walls were thicker, the firing slit angled downward to catch anyone approaching from below. He crawled around the left flank, searching for a weakness. None existed. He shifted to the right. Same problem. The Japanese had advanced. Then we start. They were layering defenses, compensating for the failures of earlier positions. He studied the airflow near the structure, noticing faint wisps of smoke leaking from a ventilation shaft carved into the rear corner. That was his entrance, but it required crossing ground nobody had crossed and lived. He inhaled once deeply, then sprinted. Gunfire erupted instantly. Rounds whipped past his legs, slicing the sand behind him. He slid the last few feet, stopping just short of the vent. He inserted the wand into the shaft and squeezed the trigger. Flame blasted inside. This time the reaction was immediate and violent. Ammunition detonated in cascading pops. The bunker shook. A hatch flew open, releasing a cloud of dust. When it cleared silence, at 1:30 p.m., he moved against a series of interconnected structures built across a shallow ridge. These bunkers used interlocking fire, meaning each one could protect the other. To break them, he needed to hit the anchor. He crawled up the ridge, hugging the contour to avoid being silhouetted. A mortar landed behind him, throwing him onto his side. His ears rang, vision swimming. For a moment he lay still, disoriented. Then he pushed himself upright, blinking through the haze, forcing his legs to move. He reached the anchor bunker, wedged himself against the doorway, and released another burst of flame. The structure shuddered. Marines seized the opening, charging forward as the crossfire collapsed. By mid-afternoon, he had repeated this pattern so many times that men trailing behind him lost count. Some said a dozen bunkers. Others insisted it was far more. The official report would later confirm that he neutralized nearly 50 fortified positions, a number so staggering that commanders reviewed it twice before submitting it. From the perspective of the men on the ground, it felt endless. A continuous sequence of sprints, crawls, bursts of flame explosions, and impossibly narrow escapes. He seemed driven by something beyond courage, a momentum that refused to break. Near the end of that terrible sequence, around 3:45 p.m., he approached what would be one of the final strong points on that flank. The Japanese inside, aware of his pattern, now waited in absolute silence. No gunfire, no movement. A trap. He sensed it immediately. Still, he continued, pausing just long enough to listen for the faint shift of boots on concrete. When he caught the hint of motion, barely audible beneath the wind, he angled the nozzle low, anticipating a grenade toss. As if on cue, a metal object arced from the slit. He rolled to the side, the grenade exploding behind him in a gout of sand. He popped to his knees and fired into the slit before the crew could recover. Heat blasted outward. The bunker died with a hollow thud. By the time he staggered away, shoulders aching, skin scorched, throat raw, the slope behind him had transformed. What had been an impenetrable wall of interlocking fire was now a broken chain of smoldering ruins. Marine officers stared at the devastation with disbelief. The advance stalled since dawn suddenly opened wide. The island had not been designed for the kind of assault he was mounting. It had been engineered for something colder, more deliberate, a mathematical machine of death conceived by General Tadamichi Kuribayashi long before the Marines ever set foot on the black sand. The Japanese command understood that they could not stop the American landing. They understood that their navy and air power were already broken. So they built a fortress that would turn every yard of ground into a calculation of blood. No banzai charges, no suicidal beach rush. Instead, pillboxes arranged in depth tunnels connecting strong points like the veins of a buried creature crossfire, plotted to the inch. It was a defensive system meant to devour time. Every hour the Marines lost on Iwo Jima meant another hour the mainland could prepare. That was the strategy. Delay equals survival. And to delay the American advance, these fortifications had been carved into the volcanic rock with a precision that bordered on obsessive. From a distance, the bunkers looked like scattered concrete blocks. Up close, they revealed themselves as nodes in a single machine. If one bunker was attacked, another would fire across the approach. If a flank opened, a concealed rifle pit would awaken. If a pillbox fell, the surviving crew retreated through tunnels, emerging somewhere unexpected. It was not chaos. It was choreography designed to bleed an attacker dry. According to the reports I have read, the Marines had never encountered anything quite like it. Even the veterans of Tarawa and Saipan, hardened by earlier battles, admitted that the fire on Suribachi felt sharper, colder, more relentless. The Japanese gunners were not improvising. They were executing a plan that had been refined for months. And that is why what he accomplished mattered far beyond the destruction of individual bunkers. Flamethrowers were not supposed to break a fortified network of this scale. They were tools for clearing isolated pockets after artillery and armor had done their work. But artillery struggled to hit targets buried under volcanic stone. Tanks could not get close without being immobilized. The system Kuribayashi designed was holding exactly as intended. Every minute the Marines remained pinned was another small victory for the defenders. Then he appeared in the middle of that system and began to burn out its connections, severing the links between bunkers. Not random destruction, not blind assault. He was disrupting the architecture of the defense. Japanese field manuals emphasized the importance of firing envelopes, overlapping arcs that kept an attacker locked in place. When he destroyed one pillbox, the next one shifted its angle. When he destroyed that one, a third bunker lost its protection and became suddenly vulnerable. The system relied on synergy. Once synergy collapsed, each position became a solitary, exposed target. He was not just taking out gun crews. He was breaking the physics of the defense, turning a fortress into a collection of isolated chambers that could not support each other. I find myself thinking about this often, how a single person, by attacking the right weaknesses in the right sequence, can make an entire strategy unravel. Not through brute force, through pressure applied at the perfect points. Japanese records later reveal that officers inside the surviving bunkers grew convinced that multiple flamethrower teams were attacking simultaneously. They refused to believe one operator could cover that much ground strike, that precisely, and survive repeated exposures. They adjusted their fire patterns, split their crew's repositioned watchers along tunnel mouths, and every adjustment created another opening for him. The defense designed to be static and indestructible was forced into movement, and movement exposed them. A fortress does not crumble when its walls break. It crumbles when its design is forced to behave in ways it was never meant to behave. By mid-afternoon, the Japanese command on that flank had exhausted its flexibility. Too many relay points burned. Too many sentry pits silenced. Too many machine gun teams collapsed in on themselves after a burst of flame stole their oxygen. The tunnels, once arteries of reinforcement, now carried smoke, heat, confusion. Survivors stumbled into positions they did not know, disoriented by the pace of the destruction. In the reports filed later, officers wrote that the defenders were blinded, a word that says everything and nothing. What blinded them was not the fire. It was the collapse of a system that only worked when every part held firm. And this is the underlying truth that emerges when reading both American and Japanese accounts. His actions shifted the tempo of the battle. Before his assault, the Marines were static. After it, they were moving. Before his assault, Suribachi's southern defenses operated with precision. After it, they were fragmented. The strategic hinge of that morning was not the number of pillboxes destroyed. It was the moment the defenders realized they could no longer predict where the next flame would strike. Uncertainty is the enemy of fortified warfare. It turns confidence into hesitation. It turns hesitation into mistakes. And in those mistakes, the Marines advanced. By late afternoon, officers on the American side understood what had changed. They saw the gap widening in the Japanese line. They saw rifle teams pushing forward into ground that just hours earlier had been lethal. They saw something else too, something more human. They saw a man returning again and again for fuel, scorched, exhausted, staggering, and yet unwilling to stop. And in that refusal, the entire flank found its momentum. When the firing finally eased in the late afternoon, sometime after 5 p.m., the Marines pushed through the corridor he had carved and saw the battlefield transformed into something unrecognizable. Positions that had spat fire since dawn were reduced to smoldering cavities. Trenches once alive with movement now lay abandoned, heat shimmering over the edges. Officers took stock of what had happened and realized that a single man, armed with a weapon that gave him mere seconds of flame at a time, had broken the strongest fortified line on that flank. But numbers alone could not explain what they saw. When he returned for yet another fuel tank, shoulders raw, where the straps had bitten through his uniform eyes, bloodshot from smoke, skin around his cheekbones reddened from radiant heat, he did not speak. He simply waited while Marines locked the new assembly into place, then nodded as if preparing for yet another run, until someone physically stepped in front of him, insisting the line had moved far enough. There was a moment, brief but noticeable, when he seemed almost confused by the suggestion that he could stop. Momentum had carried him for so many hours that stillness felt unnatural. By evening, the medical corpsman urged him to rest, to drink water, to sit. He did none of those things at first. He checked the ignition system again, wiping soot with hands that trembled from exhaustion. When finally persuaded to sit on a ration crate, he did so reluctantly, like a man pausing in the middle of a chore rather than completing one. Men gathered around him, not celebrating, not yet, because celebration felt out of place on ground still warm from fire. They looked at him as if trying to comprehend the unlikely fact that he was still alive. Some touched his arm lightly as if confirming that he was real. Someone passed him a canteen. He drank, coughed, drank again. Commanders reviewing the situation that night understood immediately that his actions had reduced casualties by a margin impossible to calculate precisely, but undeniably vast. Without the breach he created, attackers would have spent another day pinned under overlapping fire. Another day of mortar arcs descending with mathematical cruelty. Another day of dragging wounded men through sand that devoured strength with every step. Instead, the line had cracked open like a door blown from its hinges. When supply teams reached the forward units just after dusk, one lieutenant remarked that the battlefield looked like the aftermath of an artillery barrage executed from inside the Japanese fortifications rather than outside them. It was the only metaphor he could find. Fire had eaten the defenses from the core outward. Later, when the company gathered to prepare casualty reports and reorganize positions, he sat quietly apart, cleaning the nozzle assembly with slow, deliberate movements. Marines approached him one at a time, not out of ritual, but from some need to acknowledge what they had witnessed. A corporal from another platoon asked him how many bunkers he thought he had burned. He shrugged. He did not know. He did not count. Counting would have implied an end goal. He had simply gone where he was needed. In the days that followed, that answer circulated across the regiment, repeated almost with awe. He did not count. What strikes me when reading his later interviews is how little he spoke about the battle in terms of heroism. He described the flame, the heat, the noise, but not the triumph. He insisted that he acted because others could not move forward because the alternative was unacceptable. This posture of responsibility rather than valor is what separates him from the mythic image that history would later impose on him. He never claimed mastery, he claimed duty. By the time the sun rose again, Marines had advanced beyond the ground he had cleared. Engineers marked destroyed positions on their maps, counting nearly 50 fortifications rendered silent in a span of hours. Officers began drafting recommendations for commendations, though none of them at that moment understood the scale of recognition he would eventually receive. He did not join those discussions. He was already back at work inspecting the flamethrower, smoothing the straps, preparing for whatever the next hour demanded. Even victory did not loosen his posture. He behaved like a man who believed the task was never truly finished. When the battle for Suribachi ended and the flag went up on the mountain at 10:20 a.m. on February 23, 1945, the men who had survived the southern approach already knew that something irreversible had shifted. They spoke of corridors that did not exist hours earlier, of pillboxes that had once felt immortal, now lying in shards of an advance that no longer crawled, but walked. And somewhere behind that transformation sat the man who had carried the flame, separated from the noise head, bowed hands clasped loosely in his lap, as if trying to understand why he, out of all the men on that island, was still breathing. Others gathered around him in cautious circles, not out of ceremony, but because they needed to see him still human, still solid, not swallowed by the myth that had begun forming even before the smoke cleared. He seemed smaller than the stories that were already circulating, smaller than the flames he had unleashed a quiet presence in a war that devoured quiet men with ruthless efficiency. He returned stateside in the months that followed, not to parades or triumphant speeches at first, but to long stretches of silence while the nation tried to comprehend the human cost of the Pacific War. He worked, he married, he raised children, and for a time he tried to slip into the ordinary rhythm of American life, as if the island of black sand had been another lifetime sealed away. But it was not sealed. Veterans recognized him. Newspapers printed brief mentions of his citation. People shook his hand, thanked him, asked questions he did not always answer. The Medal of Honor ceremony on October 5, 1945, placed him in front of the president, placed him beneath lights that made the war feel distant, almost staged. Yet he remained the same man who had once sat on a ration crate with burned straps across his shoulders. When the medal was placed in his hands, he said later that he felt its weight differently from other decorations. Heavy, almost uncomfortably so, because he believed others had earned it alongside him, others who had not returned. In the years that followed, he spoke with students, churches, veterans, families. His voice remained steady, almost gentle, so at odds with the violence he had survived that audiences sometimes struggled to connect the two. He explained the flamethrower's mechanics. He described the island. But when asked how he found the courage to run through fire again and again, he rarely gave the answer people expected. He said he had been afraid. He said he acted because others depended on him. He said that every step he took was driven not by valor, but by duty. A word he repeated often, almost as a shield against the legend forming around him. And reading his interviews decades later, I find myself returning to that one idea, that courage, true courage, is rarely a roar. Sometimes it is a man moving forward simply because he cannot bear the thought of others dying while he stands still. With time, he became a symbol, though he never embraced the role fully. Near the end of his life, he traveled, met families of fallen Marines, helped dedicate memorials to those who had never been brought home. At each ceremony, he carried himself with the same understated gravity that defined him on Iwo Jima. He spoke of sacrifice far more than victory. He spoke of responsibility far more than heroism. And when asked what he remembered most from the battle, he did not mention the flames or the pillboxes or the day he broke a fortified line designed to kill thousands. He remembered the faces of the men who ran fuel to him under fire. He remembered the tank crew who shifted their armor to shield him. He remembered the faint voices inside pillboxes that vanished in a burst of heat. His memory was not shaped by triumph but by consequence. He remained the last surviving Medal of Honor recipient from the Pacific Theater, a living reminder of a war slipping beyond living memory. When he died in the summer of 2022, aged nearly a century, the tributes described him as a hero, a warrior, a legend. But if you listen closely to what he said throughout his life, the words he would have chosen are different. He believed he had simply done what needed to be done so that others might live. And perhaps that is what lingers most about his legacy. Not the number of positions he destroyed, not the tactical miracle he engineered, but the way he carried the burden afterward, quietly, humbly, as if the flame he once wielded had always belonged to something larger than himself.